I believe very deeply in teaching contextually. It's something that becomes so more crystal clear to me with the years of teaching, that the sense of perspective, meaning, um, culture, history, geography, and compared time periods, different forms of art, industry, um, science, understanding of the world, uh, various um, finitude fears, and how music from a function becomes a necessity for a personal transcendence. I find that, of course, one has to be very cautious because, um, on one hand, um, the student is influenceable, and that is a big responsibility for the teacher to not only say and translate into the teaching the personal experience of this or that time period of music playing, but also to back it up with some facts like crossed strung system on pianos, how it evolved from the straight strung, at least from the pianoforte before to the harpsichord and back to the lute, and going backwards into times immemorial, so to say, and understand the purpose of music in different societies, in different socio-economical systems. For instance, the house practicing of music, the virginal, the harpsichord, the clavichord, um, and then the cast iron soundboards for the pianos, which with development of bourgeoisie allowed a lot of multiplication of piano productions, and the societal organizations of arranged marriages for fiduciary advantages between families, daughters being married to chosen husbands for the purpose of exponentially expanding land and wealth. The culture that the girls were to get, typically, while the sons were sent to be naturally warriors or priests, or lawyers or bankers or businessmen. So the humanities was devoted to the women, but they were not allowed professionally, so because naturally the male-dominated Western European society wouldn't allow that, and formatted the brains of thoughtful people with great geniuses, but remained people of their own time, and that is not to be criticized. It's just within the character of the time, to understand within the time frame and understand the mindset of these geniuses who inspire us by their music, not by their life. We are curious to know about their life, but their prejudice and their ways of understanding the world or misunderstanding the world or the events, and the propaganda and the lack of communication, the lack of amazing history capacity of research because of the situations. I mean, look, the Alexandria Museum burned in antique times, and it's a whole memory of humanity is lost and will never be recovered. We only can guess what it could have been that was in there. Perhaps more than ever, our society of our time searches in the past to find a meaning to our future, because we have the capacity to travel in space and look as far as possible in the stars in the past. But we don't get many answers. Perhaps we are given to have the capacity to ask them, but not given the capacity to answer them, other than easy shortcut ones which reassure and help. And I must say, blessed those who do feel that, because if not, the anguish is too big to carry on one's own shoulders. And then individualism and this compared to the group societal communal living organization. And nowadays more than ever you have everybody listening to music on their own, watching films on their own. um, Great quality of technology, but no more to be shared with the humanity. And humanities were taught for women in the 18th, 19th, or 17th century in Western Europe, and in music, very few composers left their works being women. And I think it's a fact that has to be understood within the context of these geniuses in all art forms who created against the odds of daily life difficulties, and no vaccines against most things, and therefore they all had a very short lifespan compared to today, to grow, develop, and leave a legacy if they had to have that drive inside them. So there is an army of anonymous people who left us this historic chain reaction that adds to us, and what will we leave after us. That's an important factor too. And I am very thinking of these facts, because I think that if you don't understand the development of the industry for the construction of fortepianos and the architecture corresponding to the form of the sonata form in terms of the organization of space, would it be garden landscape architecture or buildings architecture, and I think the form is there to reassure, organize the chaos of nature, fine, by man, more or less, more than less now. Now that we have a longer life expectancy, we have time to really study more than they had the privilege before us. And probably they would have been jealous of us for having so much access, at least for most of us, to so much. So what do we do with all of that? How do we bring our culture, our exponentially expanded, let's say, horizon vista, through curiosity and through intelligent teaching, through through developing one's own understanding of the things, and perhaps going against the grain, or it's a very individual endeavor for each of us. But nevertheless, I find it very true that if we consider music written by people in whichever time period, just for the music itself and what kind of psychological message it tells us, sufferance, hope, expectation, longing, excitement, tenderness, anger, violence. And I speak of music without syllables of lyrics, just music of tones, not of words set in tones. And then how we react to it with our different cultures, as well as away from time. I mean, if you meet somebody who composed a piece 200, 300 years ago, and you wonder if they guess that we still play them, or at least some of them, study them, cherish them, publish them, republish them, search for the most original copy that we would have from which to trace our sources, and then develop by assumption of thoughts interpretational know-how, regardless if it's really the one, because obviously documental situations don't exist for that most of the time for the past. But we can get to some achievement on that point of view. And I find that we can agree to disagree if we play it on an instrument that doesn't correspond. But if we have the understanding also of what is evocative of this or that, for instance, folkloric music, like in Spain with the dance and the singing, like canta and baila, it's evocative immediately of the country through the music, and that can be said for some other countries that have such a strong musical popular transmission, oral transmission. And in a way, the cerebral construction of music, away from all of these ethnic or inherited or acquired tastes of music, uh, notating what used to be oral transmission and captivating, capturing and in a captivating way what was always translated only through words, from word to mouth for centuries, in different cultures, and what kind of music they played, and what is the role of rhythm compared to melody, and how harmony came later and polyphony much later too. It's all a construction of the mind, and how the music is then to reflect the dancing of the different styles of dances for the different social purposes of dances, and of course the religious creativity for the music that depicts for the humans. The sacred music is telling us something about our spirituality. And I find that it's very beautiful that we can browse through so many time periods. And then when I teach, I need to take in account, as I do, the time period, the instruments, the sound they produced, to understand how to shape the texture of what I literally translate as an interpretation, but also as a translated instrument. Like most of the octaves in the low registers of the left hands of the bass notes of most compositions for the, let's say, for keyboard for the last 2-3 centuries, were all based on the fact that they were straight strung, and therefore they had beautiful compartmented sound quality for the different ranges. But they didn't blend as well as the cross strung did. And therefore, the compensation they felt they have to compose by making depth with an octave lower, like cello double bass in orchestration. Then now on the modern piano overlaps the powerful of the melody. So you have to shape those octaves to translate them on the modern piano so they don't overwhelm the right hand, because you cannot take off notes pretending that because the piano of today has the thicker, bigger, richer toning basses, lines, notes, then we can change the score, but the score remains from the death of the composer to us as the only medium. So it's a way of intelligently reading and intuitively and emotionally reading it as well, in order to see how I'm going to do the mordents. Do I repeat the note on the way down, or just hold it and tie and just bite the note next to it from mordre, morden? And do I play them on the beat, the grace notes? And what is the purpose of grace notes but to delay an important note in terms of lyrical melodic line, let's say? And so if you delay, then you have to choose to extend a little bit without measuring it in rhythmic values, the note, so that you have the full length once you've reached it, which probably on the piano would be the equivalent of a glissando on a violin, or fetching the note, and the vibrato on the string instrument would be the trill, measured in perhaps Baroque, not always, unmeasured after, like a shaking of a single note, and then. So these devices corresponded to their instruments. We have to translate them to see how we can play them best with the action of the keyboard that we have today, at least as responsive as most of them can be. Because in a way, you could wonder why did composers like Chopin in the Romantic era of the 19th century in Western Europe still use notation with mordents and trills. And not notation with grace notes, which would indicate a melodization of the embellishment, which is no more just an embellishment, but part of the melodic line. Before the beat, on the beat, delayed, not delayed, or over the delayed. In a way, the rhythmic patterns of the motion of the music themselves suggest the tempo fluctuations without we adding to it the so-called rubato for everything or everywhere, or just because I feel it. And it's not wrong to play something because you feel it the way you do. And then you have to think, hear yourself, compared to perhaps what others played, but try to understand what could be the meaning for this, like the end of 1/10 first movement. 1, 2, 3, the hemiola ending instead of 1, 2, 3, 2. In other words, there is a way where you can think that I at least came to that understanding that the pulse is determined so much by the way you organize the subdivisions in the notation of the rhythmic beats. So if you have 3 times 2, 2 times 3, you have a hemiola, then you reach on a larger step rather than smaller steps. Of course, the pianist doesn't have a bow, nor does the pianist have a lung's breath to perform the instrument's notes. Only the decay after the string starts vibrating after being hit by the hammer, even prolonged by the pedals. So it can open the option to play in extremely unnatural slow tempi before the invention of the metronome, which is supposed to give us, not always, but at least it gives us some kind of idea. But before that, it was all about the vague indication for the expression allegro, andante, adagio in French, un peu animé in Deutsch, sehr, sometimes etwas rather than sehr, very, but or somewhat langsam for slow. Or how German composers understand the usage of the Italian sostenuto by Brahms for ritenuto. So yes, we have to get into all levels of translation of the notation of the music when you hear something like, you do everything in the playing to avoid the accenting on the beats, because the notation with the bar lines neatly organized in equal groups, but with the musical phrasing way overwhelmingly overlapping them, creates one thing is to keep the tempo with the beats objectively, counting or with metronome or just counting independently if you're playing. So you have tracks, and then you can eventually do a little rubato, but go back to the tracks, or then just go directly into the unknown and say, I want to just play unknown sentences, because in German Romantic literature, inspirational for Schumann to translate it in music would be with the verb at the end of the sentence in the syntax, and the tension build up of the longing and expectations for the suspended beats in syncopations. All that are ingredients that translate a state of mind, the longing, the expectation, the hope. And in a way, this poetic way of looking at the relations between what the music imitates, is it nature? In some of the Impressionism time French music, When the title is evocative, it's clear as a reflection in the water. So what reflects in the water? Is it Narcissus who looks at himself and draws to find out who this beautiful face is? Or is it too much to put into it? Or just enjoy it for the sensorial feeling? Is it drops? Is it sun rays on the skin? Or scriabin? Translating the caress in music, or the ecstasy, or the excitement, or the I mean, briskly changing moods. This roller coaster psychological exaltation to go from one extreme to the other, the Florestan to the Eusebius, the two characters that Schumann named. So do we play better because we know about the psychological life of the composer? No. Are we curious to know? Yes. Does it really bring us to understand better the structure, the organization of the structured melodic thematic material, and how to deal with the discrepancies? Why is it dubbed in one part and then the equivalent is not in the second time? Is it just a typo forgetting to be corrected from the publisher to the composer, or is it just that the composer didn't care about the details as much as we do today because of the luxury of time that we have to devote to so fine-tuned niche search into, it's fascinating, and it's almost mesmerizing. And the understanding of that context is to do also with how music is the expression of the culture of people, just like their prayers or their dances, or the important moments of their lives that have been having a musical soundtrack, so to say. And of course, when we have operas combining most of the arts plus the crafts in order to build the sets, organize the stage, this the play, the theatric actor, and singing, and the reality of the lyricism, and then the orchestration, and then the ballet and the dancing, all kinds of different forms of art that combine into the opera work in Italian. That can be also suggested in a single piano piece without all the other instruments. Of course, I'm deeply involved in teaching technique to my students so they can control what they would like to produce. Not just for the velocity, how to pass the thumb without to have an accent, or how to do the arpeggios. Okay, that velocity is essential in order to be able to play fast movements. To play slow movements, the control of the touch inside the keys or above the keys, and which speed of depressing the keys, and what type of over legato, in order to create the most beautiful, expressive in slow movements, let's say imitation of the voice singing, repeated notes included, melodically. Of course, also practicing the technique of the octaves, which of course naturally is played usually by stiffening the arms to keep the imprint, so each note that you play is an octave, regardless which, in a way. Not sevenths, because that's the greatest fear, is the wrong notes falling up on our fingers. Practiced repeatedly to go through the sections, section by section, in the practicing, on the right keys, and not on the wrong ones, obviously. So the dictatorship of the wrong note. And then when you get define if you can use the octave rebounds by the fingers scratched on the keys and then the wrist dropping to get the energy from the first to the second dropping. Of course, the precision versus the articulation and the rebouncing of the wrist would be something to organize and practice in the context of the piece. If it's a Tchaikovsky concerto, like continuous octaves to bravura effect, or Chopin. Anyway, so many examples. But the point is that the technique is the key to express one's artistry if one has such artistry to present. If it's not stifled by competition's mentality of not being other than consistent without to be too original, while inspired, but common denominator play clean, compared to those who have something that calls them to play, perhaps rediscovering in interpretation already established by many performances which are recorded since the beginning of the 20th century. So it's no more terra incognita, but still, there is room for the personal approach, even in a famous piece of a new student coming to it, and the fresh gaze on it gives a new understanding to the piece. Perhaps not in that total structure, but perhaps in a little detail, like the way to organize the breathing between the sentence. If you have a run-on sentence like forêt, in the melodic line, where do you breathe? And so now if you breathe, you have to take extra time and just do, instead of, it seems simple like that, but in fact it has to be thought of. And which length of phrase? Is it by 4 bars, 8 bars, 6, 5, 3, whichever? You have to analyze, organize, understand the traction of the harmonic progression with its own rhythmicity compared to the melodic progression, if there is one or the other. In the fugue is mostly melodic, layered over each other or under each other. The fact that we play and we teach different styles on a single instrument as the piano of today, the modern instrument of today, is the most difficult challenge. All the other instruments have to be respectfully tuned for a specific stylistic genre or time period. For the harpsichords, for instance, you shouldn't play French music on a Flemish imitation, rebuilt harpsichord in the style of. You cannot really play polyphonically on some beautiful woodwind instruments unless you have many of them. So the piano is somehow the instrument that allows to play orchestral pieces, quartets, voice, vocal pieces, dances, basically everything. Of course, in a translation, as well as what is really written for it, like a Chopin etude. Who wrote with his fingers, or Rachmaninoff also wrote with his fingers. And you feel in certain empowerment, because if it talks to your psyche as a student, as a human being of your own, regardless of what the teacher or the publisher or the review say, you make some kind of meaning of the piece for yourself, and you try to translate it in your playing. You don't want to mess it up. You want just to bring it as pristine, beautiful as you like it, love it. So you try to better yourself in order to bring it to the others. And the others will receive it, especially when they're not knowledgeable. More so as a storytelling that connects to their inner life. Since classical music is not for entertainment mostly, even if there are aspects of it with the danced, for instance, genres, but it's mostly reflective. It's mostly about thinking inside oneself, even if listened together in group with others, which is in a way very warm humanly in terms of the humanity, the brotherhood of humanity. But still, it's an individual capacity to capture which tones, which rhythms, what is blurry, what is clear. And of course, if you know the music that you hear played by somebody else, then inevitably you listen to it with a critical aspect of the fact that you know what you think the piece is supposed to be, and unless you can play it as well as you wish you need, or you have somebody else's interpretation is a idea to follow and to produce. And then in a way, so much of the culture of a performer, of the capacity of the performer, having heard, inhaled what comes through the notation, which is our medium within most of the music of the past, it's translated simply in the way you have the traction of your expression. A cheesy example because it's so emotionally obvious, but it's beautifully so, inspirationally so, regardless of the modernity of the times, that this music continues to be not really a museum piece. I think it's its own present when we are in touch with it, and when we play it, and when we enjoy the drawing of the melodic line, the shape, the phrasing, the suggestive singing vowel or consonant, and also what it vehicles psychologically: nostalgia, hope, desperation, longing. Of course, it's more directly understood than if you do something like a fugue, where you have some reflective mood, but you follow mostly the different layers moving harmoniously. And so in fact, explaining the music is in fact, or attempting to explain the music, I think is, with age, I must confess, I find it more and more impossible. The music says what it is, and it talks to us what it talks to us in our sacred, individual soul. And regardless if we might love it for a misunderstood point of view, because somebody played it for us and we don't know how it is else, because we cannot play it ourselves. And so we receive it and we think, oh, that's beautiful because such and such played it the day I liked it. So in a way, the interpretation is really putting alive the notation for the contemporaries of the day, not only for serving the best purpose of how the defunct composers would have liked it to be played. Because in a way, regardless, what matters is the now, the urgency of now. And so I help the students express what this piece means to them. And when they're a little bit stage frightened, sometimes more than a little, after having extensively practiced a piece, I always tell them, when I encourage them before they go on stage, I say, just go and enjoy it, because that's why you worked all these years or months or whatever time practicing it until the moment where you can just ephemerally share it one time through. Or it might not be, of course, the perfect way you wish it to be for having practiced it so much, but at least having practiced it so much allows you then to display it as your own narration of a beautiful story, even if you stutter here or you miss a word there. Better if you don't, of course. And I think that if one is only afraid of not reaching the idealization that we have of the piece when we practice for it sections by sections, played through once and in front of people, which is uncomfortable for the self, for the reserve or the modesty of ourselves. We feel it as an almost not very difficult to be intimate with many people with intimate thoughts and saying. So either you isolate yourself in the bubble and you ignore the audience, or you play for them in a way that you play more, everything a little more. The piano more more tender piano, the dolce more dolcissimo, the allegro more prestissimo, the forte more fortissimo. In other words, we enhance not only because eventually there is a larger room and we try to think that they won't hear us from far away. I don't think it's so much only that. I think it's the idea that we want to seduce through the beauty of the piece, and we want the audience to like the piece as we like it. Perhaps we want the audience to like us too, the way we like it. And so that's why I tell them, just go and enjoy it, and whatever happens, meant to be, but deal with the unexpected on the moment. You know, it's all these prophecies are difficult. There's no there is no universal panacea for all these things. Everybody has to find out the meaning of why they do it and how they can improve it. How much time individually it might take more than for somebody else. Regardless, it's for oneself. In order to better oneself in the sculpting service of the muse. Because the spiritual level of translation between what we play and those who receive it, while immaterial, cannot be boxed, cannot be wrapped, cannot be defined really, remains in fact one of the most important moments of human sharing on earth. Could be the emotion of a sports gesture, the emotion of a melodic line, I think it's very meaningful. And one has to accept it as a performer, to be one of the listeners plus the performer. You also receive it. Sometimes you get puzzled because somehow the music reveals itself differently, because the acute listening that you exercise when this group of people who are keeping their breath from being, let's say, coughing or something, they're attentive to what you present to them. And this intense silence of held noise making by the audience makes you also hear the piece while you play it in the industry of playing more accurately or more acutely, and all of a sudden reveals itself in a ways that you haven't heard it when you repetitively practice section by section on your own, and in a way your listening monitors more or less, but you're not as acutely there as the attention span you give it the day you have to perform it through. So the capacity of the quality of the discerning hearing, the intuitive hearing, the monitoring hearing of what you produce and how it's received. Perhaps you don't know how it's received, but you know how you emit that sound, the emission, and then they receive it. And one has always one's favorite spots in one's piece, and one's feared spots technically in one's piece, and one can consider then the performance for the performer point of view from it is just a race of obstacles to avoid in order to arrive at the finish line without too many regrets. But thankfully, it's encouraging to see students be themselves self-critical more than the teacher. And sometimes it's not productive, but it's a necessary developmental step of the studies. So this way, when they come out from stage, they can say something, and most of them do. Oh, I didn't do at all anything of what I wanted. It didn't come out, the piano didn't respond, my fingers were stuck cold, freezing. I don't know why, my muscles were this or that. You can find all kinds of reasons, and most of them are valid. It's a psychology, it's a physiology, it's a concentration capacity, is managing one's in comfortability to be in front of people, being listened and watched while performing. And when you mix all that together, you realize that immediately they say, rightfully, because that's what makes humanity advance, hope. They always say, oh, I'll do better the next time. And better than if they're so satisfied that they don't need to. And of course, not everybody who plays music has the same drive into playing it, or the same patience to practice repetitively in order to create that translation of the beauty of the piece that you read, in order to unfiltered and unmistakingly translating it to the audience. But then again, it's a subjective fact of the point of view of the tempo, of the pulse. If you start the Waldstein or more staccato, you already hint something different in character. It's like all of a sudden it's more jumpy or more connected. And if it's faster, or is it, and if it's slower, it's not just speed, it's space, it's projection, it's arrival point, it's downbeat, upbeat, on which step, on which, basically it becomes a global choice of how you're going to play the piece according to how you will rhythmically establish it while you perform. And in real time, the brain doesn't compute so many things easily. That's why we practice it to gain some rhythmic memory, or perhaps finger memory even, for some of the shiftings. And yes, there is a level of automatization of the playing that results from practicing sections many times. I don't want to give a number, but as much or as many as needed. But of course, we can betray our preparation by being nervous on stage, and be angry with ourselves, saying, I never made a mistake in this spot, but the other spot that I was fearing went not bad. It's constant evaluation, self-evaluation. And I think that the analytical understanding of the text, with the form, structure, harmony, melody, contrapuntal elements, pedal for the combination of overlapping harmonies, the kind of resonance you want, wish or depend of, according to how much you can master a given instrument, because the actions is always different. Not to mention not very often well regulated. And that is only that aspect of things, is before you perform it, and then during the performance it's almost as if you don't control as much, and it controls you, the destiny of the moment. I believe that in time students become more confident, because they manage to go from point A to point B or Z, hopefully at the end of the piece, through different paths that they have negotiated intelligently, with some muscular memory, with some projected thought ahead of time, beat, phrasing, dynamic, not too early, too loud, not too early, too slow, merge in traffic when you return at tempo. Find a way to trace the piece imaginarily, like an ephemeral blueprint of a building that it's not gonna be built, but that we sort of dream, imagine. And perhaps it's the colors that are suggested to you by the harmonies, or the shapes, or perhaps the sensorial feeling of cold and warm, or cuddly and uncomfortable, something like a toccata immediately tells us something about the way we have to translate the touches of these chopped notes, compared to Is it over legato or just legato? Or air legato? Or combined? Or simply? But simply is not simple. It's just um, everything else that you have tried and forgotten and blending into this the simple line you're producing. In a way, you don't play the piano to prove a point. You play the piano to receive through your playing the enchantment of the piece's production through your own um, I would say synergy of different elements, but I would say, yeah, the industry of playing. Even if you suffer serving the muse, you suffer in order to produce something pure, like a sculpture that comes from the raw material, and you present something very refined. And I believe very much in context, because I think that the more you are cultivated about the time periods of the music you serve, the better you translate them, at least for your own conviction that you make out of all this information. And that is, I think, a very satisfying factor. It's like watching a painting by yourself and just seeing what it is, compared to having next to you an art historian who explains to you so much more about symbolisms, innuendos, in the choice of this, in the choice of that, the background, the foreground. And you go like, oh, I didn't see all that when I was watching it. So perhaps I don't hear all these things that I was told when I studied it. But at the end of the circle, before playing it and learning it in order to play it, you have to still go back to the starting point where you play it in order to satisfy your audible senses for your psyche. Of course, if not, you would paint, or you sculpt, or you could write poems, or play with the music of the words in a display that presents the meaning of what you want to suggest. I think we all are very sensitive to different aspects of the senses that we can be attuned to, as performers or as listeners plus performer. And I find it so beautiful, because people come from such different backgrounds, from distant continents, and they enter in osmosis, almost in love with a given musical world of a composer they serve. Let's say Ravel coming from Korea, or say Bach coming from China. And the universality of the music is not that anything goes because it's beautiful or just general words. I think it's to do with every detail of the innuendos of the piece, and how regardless of the culture from which one comes, the language that one was told, the mother tongue, how it shaped the ear, and therefore how the musical ear is shaped when shaping this, or rather the tones that you play on the piano, changes a lot, or brings a new point of view, because it would be very reductive to think that only Germans will play Schumann and French will play Debussy and Russians will play Rachmaninoff. Though they might understand it at the get-go level faster, because in a way it corresponds to the socio-cultural ways of behaving of their cultures. And they don't need to study what is the style of it, because it's self-evident. And perhaps not for all, but let's say the beauty of it is that, in fact, people from any continent could play music from any other time period from another continent if they attune to it with their really enthused spontaneity, and polished with knowledge rather than the opposite in a way, because too much knowledge might kill the spontaneity, and you want to keep the balance of the two in order to be captivatingly driven, interesting, and perhaps intriguing for the listener in the way you do the storytelling of the given piece. I take very much at heart when I teach to respect by listening what the students heard differently from how I heard the given piece that I'm teaching them, that they chose to play, or I asked them to play, or they have to play because of a program of a competition or so on. So some musics that they play are more connected to folklore, some are more cerebral organizations of thought, some are stylistically different, and they would play a whole program with at least 3 or 4 styles, which then either you have to blend it to be all just piano, because that's what you play, it's not oboe or flute or harp or organ. It could be evocative of, but it will never be but evocative, which is already great. Shadows and lights rather than colors perhaps, but we can call it tastes, colors. I mean, every teacher has a different way to describe the richness of the texture, of the importance of the choice of the ranges, and like in the Ravel Sonatine, the hands are always intertwined regardless if he plays in the high register or the low register, and he goes. So yes, you're sensitive to the topography, the geography, the history of the terrain. That is an early Bach piece, a later Bach piece stylistically, compared to early Beethoven's piece to a later Beethoven piece. Some composers change their style through their age, regardless if they hopefully could live long enough. For some, regretfully not, because we will never know. But it's not a straight path forward. We learn to study. When we study, we learn the time periods: Baroque, classical, romantic, modern, contemporary. And okay, some fit in the box and some overlap in the box, because some modernists were already ahead of their time, when at the same time period some were more back-looking and re-enriching the past that perhaps they studied and liked. Perhaps somebody finds always a musical best area or era time both, to express themselves better by saying, oh, I'm very at ease in the romantic era, or I only like the modern music, even if there isn't one of each, because each of the composers brings in each style so many different of their own personal creativity, of course, but also cultures. And I always wonder if at the end of all this reflection about teaching knowledge and still nurturing spontaneity, to give the student the capacity to feel free. Sometimes they make a misread note, which in fact could have plausibly it's plausible to have been the case, but it's just wrong. So I have to make sure that, of course, that's the basic job of the teacher, to make sure they play the right notes, right? But beyond that is how. And then comes the shifting, the preparation to fetch a bass and shape it in which dynamic range, even if it's a fast tempo. Not grab and miss, or just try to hope to catch it. And then you go, the tempo, then the sound, the color, the legato, the voicing. And it's just really like sculpting, like the beginning of the slow movement, of the Appassionata. So it's humbling, because as a teacher, I arrive in the lesson as the person who already has gone through, if not this piece, most of these pieces time period. And so if you have played all the mazurkas of Chopin, it's good. If you have played 3/4 of them, you might find things in common toolbox with the others, even if they have individual fields, like 555 sonatas by Scarlatti. Also, of course, some things are recurrent, some things are unexpected, some things are quirky. Sometimes you don't know if the composer was even aware that he or she was doing something so unexpected that if it had to be guessed, had it been unfinished, you would have been rightfully said, oh, but in this style, this composer would have never done that. And sometimes they surprise you by doing it. In a Beethoven sonata, who would have said? Sounds jazzy, if any. And of course, within the context is different. That's why I insist so much on context, because it's in a D major sonata. Or Schumann changing meter, adding a 4/4 bar inside all these groups of 3/4 bars, bar a beat beat. The context doesn't explain everything, just gives us some kind of guidelines. Free to us to even go against it for a conviction and say this is what in fact should have been. Once you really know the DNA of the thoughts of the composer, at least that you get close enough to think that you know or you guess what they would have done if they had done it differently. Then comes the point of composing, where most people don't dare do because they feel like so much was done, why me? And I find that even if it appears arrogant to say, yes, me, it could be also rooted in a lot of, and it is in my case, humility, because I'm aware of all that. I'm not just willingly ignoring how much beautiful music was written before mine, and that mine might never anyway measure. It's not the point even. The point is I have to say something, I say it musically. Then if it means something to others, as it does in many cases that I hear in performances of my own music, then I feel like, oh, they understood my storytelling or narrative content of the piece just with the written signs on the score. Just like I try to do when I teach the famous, without to compare of course myself to them, but when I as a teacher teach the famous composers. And what I think they meant, they wished, they thought, they hinted, the rubato, the this, the that. And for my own music, when it's performed, the fact that it means something to the performer, then it becomes meaningful to them. That's the most beautiful gift I can receive, because that's what I receive from the greatest musicians I love to teach, play, perform, practice, conduct, dream basically about. I'm very thankful for you being here and me sharing with you some of these thoughts.